What is the biggest mystery from ancient history? Story 1. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was the most interconnected civilization the world had ever produced. The Mycenaean Greeks traded with the Hittites. The Hittites wrote letters to the Egyptians. Merchant ships carried standardized cargo across thousands of miles. Palace bureaucracies ran on complex. It was, by every measure, a functioning international order. Within 50 years, essentially all of it was gone. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, vanished so completely that its existence was forgotten for 3,000 years. Cities across Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Cyprus were destroyed or abandoned simultaneously. Writing itself, what followed is called the Greek Dark Ages. The collapse coincided with a 300-year megadrought, a rapid-fire series of major earthquakes between 1225 and 1175 BC, mass migrations, and the collapse of the trade networks that kept everything running. Drought, famine, earthquakes, invasion, each one individually survivable. All of them together, hitting a civilization whose complexity made it catastrophically fragile. The interconnectedness that made the Bronze Age world great made it incapable of absorbing simultaneous failures. Each collapse cascaded into the next. Any one of these events is probably not enough to bring down 8 civilizations. Together, they didn't just end an era, they ended the world. The last known text from Ugarit is a letter from the king describing enemy ships attacking his coast, and no reply was ever sent. The city was burned shortly after. The letter sat in a kiln, accidentally preserved by the fire that ended everything, waiting 3,200 years for someone to read it. Story 2. Sometime in the early 15th century, someone in Central Europe sat down with a goose quill and 240 pages of calfskin vellum and wrote a book that has not been read since. The script flows beautifully left to right. It has consistent grammar. It has word frequency distributions that match natural language. It has sections that look like a herbal, an astronomical atlas, a biological diagram, a recipe book. It looks, in every superficial way, like a medieval encyclopedia. Nobody has ever read a single word of it. William Friedman, the man who cracked Japan's purple cipher in World War II, spent decades on it and failed. The NSA has studied it. Alan Turing had a copy. A large language model trained on 37 million historical texts was run on it in 2025 and produced output that academic linguists are still arguing about. The theories run the hoax theory that someone in the 15th century fabricated a convincing fake to sell to gullible collectors keeps running into the same wall. A hoax would need to produce 240 pages of text that perfectly mimics the deep statistical properties of natural language, using only pen and vellum, consistently across the entire manuscript, without ever slipping. The statistical features the text exhibits were not mathematically describable until the 20th century. Whoever faked it would have needed to know things that wouldn't be discovered for 500 years. A 2024 study by researchers Keegan Brewer and Michelle Lewis proposed the entire manuscript is a coded medieval gynecology text women's medical written in cipher because discussing such topics openly was considered dangerous. The bathing figures aren't bizarre. They're anatomical. The plants aren't imaginary. They're symbolic. It is the most grounded theory in years, and it is still unproven. The most honest answer to what the Voynich manuscript is? We don't know. We don't know who wrote it, why, in what language, or what it contains. We know it's real. The vellum, the ink, the binding are all genuinely 15th century. We know the text has internal structure consistent with meaning. We know that every serious attempt to extract that meaning has failed. The manuscript is currently housed at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library. You can view high-resolution scans of every page online. Millions of people have looked at it. The words remain as unreadable today as the day they were written. Whatever it says, whoever wrote it, they took the key with them 600 years ago, and nobody has found it since. Story 3. The Druids were fully literate. This is the first thing most people don't know. They understood writing. They used it for contracts, for records, for correspondence. What they refused to write down was their religion deliberately, as policy, for reasons Caesar tells us they explained as protecting sacred knowledge from falling into the wrong. Everything that mattered, the cosmology, the theology, the ritual, the philosophy, was memorized and transmitted orally, teacher to student, across generations. It took up to 20 years to train a druid. The knowledge was vast, complex, and entirely inside human minds, which meant that when the Romans came, they didn't need to burn libraries. They just needed. The Roman campaign against Druidism was not incidental to the conquest of Gaul and Britain. It was a deliberate policy. Emperor Claudius banned Druidic practice entirely. Tacitus records the final assault on the Druid stronghold at Anglesey in 61 AD. Roman soldiers crossing the strait to find Druids on the shoreline, arms raised, screaming curses, surrounded by women in black robes with torches. The Romans cut them down. They destroyed the sacred groves. They killed everyone they found. Not a single Druid survived who was not in hiding. And the ones in hiding had no community left to transmit knowledge to. Within a generation, the oral chain that had carried the religion for centuries was broken. Whatever they knew died with the last person. Story 4. Around 1200 BC, as the Bronze Age was collapsing, Egyptian records began describing waves of attackers arriving by sea-burning cities, destroying trade routes, overwhelming armies. Pharaoh Ramesses III recorded defeating them in a great naval battle around 1177 BC. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depicts them in extraordinary detail: their ships, their weapons, their distinctive feathered headdress, their faces. Women and children traveled with them on ox carts. They weren't just raiding, they were migrating. The Egyptians named at least 9 distinct groups: the Peliset, Teker, Shekelish, Shurdan, Luka, Denyen, Teresh, Weshish, and Ekwesh. And here is the problem. We know their names. We know their faces. We know their swords were identical to those from northern Italy. We do not know where they came from, who they were, or what happened to them after. The theories span the entire Mediterranean. The Shurdan are speculatively linked to Sardinia, the Shekelish to Sicily, the Ekwesh possibly to Mycenaean Greeks. Their helmets are nearly identical to those worn by Bronze Age Greek warriors. The Peliset are most convincingly identified as the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, who settled coastal Palestine after the collapse and left distinctive Aegean-style pottery behind. But the term Sea Peoples itself was not even coined until the 19th century. It was invented by archaeologists grouping together Egyptian descriptions of various attackers. Whether these 9 groups were a unified confederation, a loose coalition of or entirely separate peoples who happened to appear simultaneously is still debated. The most compelling modern view is the darkest one. The Sea Peoples were not invaders. They were victims, refugees from the same megadrought and civilizational collapse that was destroying everyone else: Mycenaeans, Minoans, Anatolians, driven from their own collapsing homelands and pushing south and east in search of food and survival. The women and children on the ox carts are the giveaway. You don't bring your family on a raid. You bring them when you have nowhere left to go. The great boogeymen of the Bronze Age collapse were probably running from the same catastrophe they're blamed for causing. And then, after Egypt, they disappear. No written records, no identified homeland, no confirmed descendants except possibly the Philistines. They came from nowhere, destroyed everything, and vanished back into silence. Story 5. The story everyone knows goes like this. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's fire. One catastrophic night. Up to 700,000 scrolls, the entire accumulated knowledge of the ancient world gone in flames. It's a clean story. A villain. A moment. A tragedy. It is almost certainly not what happened. Ancient writers who were alive within decades of Caesar's Alexandria campaign described the museum, the institution housing the library, as still functioning. The fire Caesar's troops started was in the harbor, aimed at enemy ships. Whether it spread to the library at all is disputed. Whether it destroyed more than a warehouse of scrolls waiting to be shipped is almost certainly not true. The dramatic story took about 100 years after the fact to fully form, and it formed in the hands of writers who weren't there. The real answer is slower and harder to romanticize. The Library of Alexandria declined across centuries through political instability, through the shifting of Rome's center of gravity away from Egypt, through the gradual defunding of scholarly institutions as Ptolemaic wealth evaporated, through wars and sieges that damaged the city repeatedly without anyone bothering to specifically record what happened to the books. Papyrus scrolls do not survive neglect. They don't need a fire. They need humidity, insects, and a decade of nobody caring, and they're gone. The murder mystery of who burned the library, Caesar, Christians, Muslim conquerors, misses the real culprit entirely. Story 6. The alien theory is the least interesting answer because it assumes the most insulting thing, that ancient humans couldn't have done it. A 2024 study confirmed a now extinct branch of the Nile ran directly past the Giza Plateau, which means the Egyptians almost certainly floated the heaviest limestone blocks to the site on barges. Wet sand in front of sledges reduces friction dramatically, and Egyptian tomb painting literally shows a worker pouring water ahead of a sled, carrying a colossal statue. They left us the instruction manual. We just assumed they couldn't have known. Stonehenge is more interesting. The massive sarsen stones come from Marlborough Downs, 25 miles away. Fine. But the inner blue stones, each weighing up to 4 tons, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 200 miles away. A 2025 study confirmed humans carried them, not glaciers, which means Neolithic people with no wheels, no iron tools, and no written language organized the transport of 4-ton boulders across 200 miles of British terrain. Rope, timber rollers, rafts, and an organizational system sophisticated enough to coordinate thousands of people across generations. The altar stone, the 6-ton centerpiece, came from Scotland, over 400 miles. The how is mostly solved. The why. Why did an entire civilization redirect its agricultural surplus into stacking 2.3 million limestone blocks? Why did Neolithic people drag 4-ton Welsh boulders across Britain? For reasons nobody recorded. The engineering is impressive. The collective obsession required to sustain it for generations that is the mystery that actually keeps archaeologists. Story 7. In 1913, 2 South African farmers arguing over skull fragments they dug up while building a drainage ditch inadvertently uncovered one of the most fascinating and contested mysteries in human prehistory. The skull found near the small town of Boskop had a cranial capacity estimated between 1,750 and 1,980 cubic centimeters. The average modern human brain sits around 1,400. The Boskop skull housed something significantly larger, a big-eyed, childlike-faced individual with a forehead that ballooned forward in a way that looked, to early 20th century anatomists, unsettlingly like the alien faces on science fiction covers. Lauren Isley wrote of them, back there in the past, 10,000 years ago, the man of the future with a big brain and small teeth. He lived in Africa. His brain was bigger than your brain. 2 neuroscientists, Gary Lynch and Richard Granger, ran the numbers in their 2008 book Big Brain and calculated that a population averaging 1,750 cc brain volume would have a mean IQ of around 149. Genius tier, across an entire population. Now, most modern anthropologists regard the Boskop race as a scientific artifact, a handful of unusually large skulls from anatomically modern humans, possibly just the large end of normal variation, inflated into a separate species by researchers with 1915-era biases. The evidence is genuinely thin. The debate is genuinely unresolved. But here is what is not debated. Brain size alone did not save them. Whatever they were, a distinct population, a variant, a handful of outliers, they are gone. The best current theory is that raw cognitive horsepower without the external scaffolding of writing, accumulated culture, and civilization to run it on is just expensive tissue. All that potential locked in skulls with no library to download into. Pre-civilization Earth had no room. We inherited the planet anyway, and somehow still managed to invent the internet. Story 8. Around 50 AD, a Greek mathematician and engineer named Hero of Alexandria built a device called the aeolipile, a metal sphere, mounted on a pivot, fed by steam from a boiling vessel below, with two bent nozzles that expelled steam and caused the sphere to spin. It was real. It demonstrated clearly that steam could generate rotational motion. Hero listed it as the 50th of 78 devices in his treatise on pneumatics. It was not the centerpiece, it was a curiosity, a lecture demonstration, a thing to show students how steam pressure behaved. Nobody built a factory around it. Nobody put it in a mine. Nobody attached anything to it. It spun. People nodded. It stopped. Life continued. The reason is not that ancient Romans were less intelligent. The reason is that they had no problem that required solving. The first practical steam engines in 18th century England were built specifically to pump water out of flooded coal mines, a concrete, urgent, expensive problem that slave labor couldn't solve, because you couldn't send slaves a mile underground There were no coal mines in ancient Rome at that scale. There was no problem that demanded a mechanical solution. And critically, there were slaves. Millions of them. An economy built entirely on forced human labor has no financial incentive to develop labor-saving machinery. Why spend resources engineering a machine to do what a slave cost nothing to feed and replace? Invention doesn't happen. It happens when a specific problem meets a specific economic incentive, meets a specific ecosystem of materials, skills, and accumulated knowledge. England in 1760 had coal, iron, capital markets, patent law, a culture of practical tinkering, and a labor shortage driving wages up. Rome in 50 AD had none of that. Hero's engine was not ahead of its time. It was exactly on time for a lecture hall. The Industrial Revolution wasn't delayed by a failure of imagination. It was delayed by a failure of necessity. Story 9. Since 1739, when the first one turned up in the English Midlands, archaeologists have been finding small 12-sided bronze objects scattered across the northern provinces of the Roman Empire: France, Germany, Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands. Over 130 confirmed examples. Each one has 12 pentagonal faces. Each face has a circular hole of a different size, and each corner has a small spherical knob. They range from golf ball to tennis ball in size. They are clearly made with skill and intention. Not one of them appears anywhere in Roman literature, artwork, or records. For an empire that documented everything from military payroll to sewage infrastructure, the complete absence of any reference to an object found in over 100 locations is, to put it mildly, strange. The theories are numerous, and none is proven. Candlestick holders' wax was found inside some, but the holes are the wrong size. Dice but no two have the same dimensions, which makes for terrible dice. Artillery rangefinders plausible but unverifiable. Astronomical instruments for calculating sewing date someone built a working model and it functions, but so does knitting tools for making gloves. A YouTuber 3D printed one and demonstrated it works perfectly for this, and the varying hole sizes correspond to different finger widths. It is currently the most popular theory. It is still unproven. Here is the detail that tilts it towards something more significant than a glove tool. None have ever been found in Italy or the Mediterranean core of the empire. Only the northern provinces. Only the Celtic fringe. One was found in a woman's grave, placed next to a rod suggesting it was mounted as a scepter. Researchers at Belgium's Gallo-Roman Museum believe they were used in magical rituals, which would explain why Rome never wrote about them. You don't document the sacred. You bury it. And then you take the Story 10. In 1963, a man in the Cappadocia region of Turkey knocked down a wall in his basement during renovations and found a room behind it. Then another room. Then a tunnel. Then 18 levels of tunnels, chambers, stables, kitchens, storage rooms, churches, schools, and a winery, carved entirely by hand into the soft volcanic rock, descending 85 meters below the surface, deep enough to fit a 20-story building. Derin Kuyu. the largest excavated underground city ever found, capable of sheltering an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock, food stores, and everything they needed to stay alive indefinitely without going above ground. The engineering alone, over 3,500 ventilation shafts, provided fresh air to every level, some doubling as water wells, designed so that if a surface force poisoned one water source, it wouldn't contaminate the rest. The corridors narrowed deliberately at certain points, so attackers couldn't advance in formation. And the doors' massive circular stone discs, up to half a ton each, rolled across the tunnel entrances from the inside, with a small hole in the center so defenders could spear anyone trying to push through. You could lock out an army and sit comfortably 80 meters below while they stood helplessly above you. Nobody knows exactly who built it or when. Estimates range from the Bronze Age through to early Christian communities using it as refuge from Roman. What is known is that it was expanded over centuries by successive populations who kept making it deeper, larger, and more livable. Derinkuyu is connected underground to at least 9 other subterranean cities across Cappadocia by tunnels kilometers long. The total network may extend further than archaeologists have yet mapped. Somewhere down there, a child grew up, went to school, learned a trade, and considered that dark carved stone world completely normal. The claustrophobia is yours. It wasn't there. Story 11. The Antikythera mechanism is the one that breaks everyone. Pulled from a Roman-era shipwreck in 1901, it sat in a museum for decades looking like corroded bronze junk before someone X-rayed it, and found inside dozens of precisely interlocking bronze gears capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses decades in advance, tracking the 4-year Olympic cycle, and modeling the movements of the known planets. It is, functionally, an analog computer. It dates to around 100 BCE. The next known device of comparable mechanical complexity appears over 1,000 years later in medieval Islamic clockwork. One scholar described it perfectly. It is an island of sophistication in a sea of lost time. And here is the question that nobody has adequately answered. We found one. Just one. If ancient Greek civilization had reached the level of precision instrument making required to produce the Antikythera mechanism, where is the ecosystem that produced it? Where are the workshops, the apprentices, the tools, the intermediate prototypes, the other examples? Technology doesn't appear fully formed from nothing. It accumulates. The mechanism implies an entire tradition of precision engineering, and that tradition has left almost no other trace. The same question applies to the Iron Pillar of Delhi, standing for 1,600 years without rusting, using a metallurgical process modern engineers still find difficult to replicate. To the precisely drilled diorite bowls of ancient Egypt, carved from one of the hardest stones on Earth, with a smoothness that implies rotary tools nobody has found. To the concrete of the Pantheon, whose formula was lost and only partially reverse-engineered in the 20th century. The honest answer is probably not lost civilizations or alien intervention. It is that human ingenuity has always had the capacity to produce brilliant, isolated leaps, and that most of what was ever made, thought, or built was not preserved. We are reading history from the tiny fraction that survived. What we call ancient sophistication might simply be the rare moments when something durable enough to last happened to be sophisticated enough to astonish us. The rest burned, rotted, or melted down. The mystery is not that these objects exist. The mystery is how many more there were that didn't make it. Story 12. The North Equatorial Current runs like a conveyor belt from the west coast of Africa directly to the Caribbean. Anything that enters it driftwood, seeds, boats, gets carried westward. In 1969, explorer Thor Heyerdahl sailed a papyrus reed boat built using ancient Egyptian construction methods from Morocco to within 600 miles of Barbados before the vessel became waterlogged. The following year, he completed the crossing. The ocean does most of the work. You don't need advanced navigation. You need a seaworthy vessel, and the current does the rest in roughly 50 days. The question of whether pre-Columbian Africans could have reached the Americas is not really a question at all. Of course they could have. The debate is whether they did, and whether we would know if they had. The Olmec colossal heads of ancient Mexico, carved between 1500 and 400 BC, are the most cited evidence. 17 massive stone faces with features that first-hand observers, including the Mexican explorer who discovered them in 1862, described as distinctly African. Mainstream archaeology attributes them entirely to indigenous Olmec peoples and points out that no confirmed African artifact has ever been found in a pre-Columbian context. The counter-argument is that contact without colonization leaves almost nothing behind. No fort, no settlement, no imposed infrastructure, just knowledge exchange, trade goods, possibly genetics, most of which degrades, assimilates, or gets attributed to local development, which is the philosophically interesting part. Columbus came and immediately began claiming, naming, and subjugating. That impulse to possess what you find is not universal. Many West African maritime cultures of the period had sophisticated seafaring traditions and extensive trade networks built on exchange, not extraction. A civilization that reaches a new shore and thinks, interesting, let's trade and go home, leaves a fundamentally different archaeological signature than one that thinks this belongs to us now. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It might be evidence of a completely different relationship. Story 13. First, the Mayans did not vanish. Their descendants, numbering around 7 million, still live in Mexico and Central America. What vanished was the classic Maya civilization, the great lowland cities of Tikal, Palenque, Cap Caracol, which between 750 and 900 say underwent a catastrophic population collapse so severe that cities housing hundreds of thousands of people were abandoned to the jungle within decades. Not conquered, not burned, just left. Temples still standing. Inscriptions mid-sentence. The people simply stopped being there. The drought theory was the dominant explanation for decades. Stalagmite records from Belizean caves confirmed a century-long dry period coinciding exactly with the collapse. Then, in 2025, a study of sediment records from the Guatemalan site of Itzan found something that complicated everything. Itzan had stable rainfall throughout the collapse period. No drought. Favorable conditions, and yet its population declined just as sharply. Agriculture disappeared, and the site was abandoned at the same time as drought-stricken neighbors. A community with water and food collapsed anyway, which means drought alone was never the whole story. The 2025 research points towards something that should sound uncomfortably familiar. The Maya cities were a complex network of trade, political alliances, and economic dependence meant that when drought hit the central lowlands, the cascading failure rippled outward wars, migration, economic breakdown, dragging even stable communities into collapse. The system was tightly coupled. One region failed and pulled the others with it. Overpopulation, deforestation, elite warfare over water control, and climate stress hit simultaneously. Like the Bronze Age collapse 3,000 years earlier, the sophistication that built the civilization made it catastrophically fragile. The jungle didn't swallow them. The system did. Story 14. In the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, a Roman temple sits on a foundation that the Romans almost certainly did not build. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek is impressive enough on its own terms, one of the largest religious structures the Roman Empire ever attempted. But what stops engineers and archaeologists cold are the 3 stones underneath it. The trilithon. 3 limestone blocks, each roughly 62 feet long, 14 feet high, fitted so precisely together that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them, set into the western podium wall about 20 feet above the ground. Each one weighs between 800 and 1,000 metric tons. The heaviest stones at the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh around 80 tons. The trilithon stones are 10 times heavier. Moving them, even with modern heavy lift equipment, would be at the extreme edge of what is technically possible today. 800 meters away, in the limestone quarry where they were cut, lie 3 more stones that were never moved at all. The largest, discovered in 2014, weighs approximately 1,650 tons. It is fully carved, separated from the bedrock, clearly intended for the site. It never got there. Nobody knows why the project stopped, who was moving them, or how far along the transport had progressed. There is no archaeological evidence, no abandoned intermediate stones, no ramp system, no trace of the mechanism between the quarry and the temple. The stones appear at the destination and in the quarry. The journey between them left nothing behind. The deep mystery is not the Romans. Evidence suggests the megalithic foundation predates Roman construction, possibly by centuries. The Romans built their temple on top of something that was already there, already placed, already impossibly heavy. Who cut those stones? How they moved the ones that reached the site? And why they abandoned the largest one in the quarry are questions that have produced dozens of theories and no consensus. The site sits at the outer boundary of what human engineering without modern machinery can theoretically achieve, and exactly at that boundary, the record goes silent. Story 15. The Celts were not a unified civilization. They were a sprawling collection of tribal cultures spread across Ireland, Britain, Gaul, Iberia, and into Central Europe, each with their own local traditions, their own gods, their own stories. What bound them was language, art, and a system of oral knowledge transmission so sophisticated that the Druids reportedly spent 20 years memorizing it. Not a word of it was written down by choice. Writing was considered a degradation of sacred knowledge. The act of putting something in text made it static, accessible to outsiders, and stripped of the living context that gave it meaning. So the entire cosmology, theology, mythology, and ritual practice of the Celtic world existed exclusively inside human minds. Then came the Romans, who killed the Druids. Then came Christianity, which converted the survivors. The myths that eventually made it into writing the Irish cycles, the Welsh Mabinogion, the Arthurian traditions were transcribed by Christian monks in the 7th century and later. Men who preserved what they found fascinating while quietly excising what contradicted their faith, and who reinterpreted gods as heroes, otherworld realms as fairy, and divine beings as kings. The goddess Brigid became Saint Brigid. The Feast of Samhain became All Souls' Day. The whole pantheon got a new coat of paint, and the original colors are largely gone. What remains is still extraordinary. Queens turned into flies, swallowed, reborn as warriors. Silver-handed gods, cauldrons that resurrect the dead, shape-shifting poets, a land of eternal youth accessible through fairy mounds and the bottom of lakes. The strangeness is authentic even when the theology isn't. The oral tradition had enough momentum that even filtered through centuries of Christian redaction, the sheer otherworldliness of the original source comes through. You can feel something ancient underneath the monastery ink. You just can't be certain what it actually said. And that gap between what survived and what was is where all the best fiction lives. Story 16. Before Rome was Rome, the Etruscans ruled central Italy. They were skilled metallurgists, sophisticated traders, prolific artists, and architects of a culture so advanced that the early Romans borrowed from them almost wholesale gladiatorial combat, religious ritual, architectural engineering, the toga, the fasces that became the symbol of Roman authority, possibly the founding of Rome itself. The first kings of Rome were Etruscan speakers. Everything that made Rome Rome in its earliest centuries came substantially from people the Romans would later barely acknowledge. The language is the deepest mystery. We can read Etruscan. The alphabet was adapted from Greek, and its sounds are understood. What we cannot do is translate it beyond roughly 1,000 words, mostly names and simple funerary formulae. Etruscan has no known parent language. Every other European language traces back to the Indo-European migrations of the Bronze Age. Etruscan predates them and survived independently, a linguistic island in a continent of related tongues with no relatives anywhere. Dionysius of Halicarnassus noted in the 1st century BC that it bore no resemblance to any known language. The Roman Emperor Claudius was so fascinated, he learned to speak it and wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans. That work has not survived. DNA research has now settled where they came from. They were genetically local, descended from the same steppe Bronze Age migrants as their Latin-speaking neighbors, which means the language was an even older survival, a pre-Indo-European holdover that somehow persisted for millennia before Latin finally swallowed it. They didn't vanish dramatically. They assimilated, intermarried, adopted Latin, stopped writing in Etruscan, and faded out of distinct cultural identity over about 3 centuries of Roman expansion. The last known Etruscan inscription dates to around the 1st century CE. After that, silence. A civilization that shaped everything Rome became dissolved so completely into its successor that Rome itself had trouble explaining where it had come from. The 20 volumes that might have told us burned, or rotted, or simply didn't survive the library fires. And the language they spoke remains the greatest untranslated mystery in the ancient Mediterranean. Story 17. Plato wrote about Atlantis in 360 BC, a technologically advanced island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules that sank in a single day and night due to earthquakes and floods. Most historians treat it as a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris dressed in mythological geography. But Plato was specific in ways that pure allegory rarely requires concentric rings of land and water, exact dimensions, a location outside the Strait of Gibraltar, a destruction coinciding with an Athenian war. Either he was an unusually precise fiction writer, or he was working from something. The best real candidate is Spartel Bank, a submerged island just outside the Strait of Gibraltar that was above water during the last ice age and was swallowed by rising seas around 11,600 years ago, exactly the time frame Plato describes. Geological surveys have found evidence of a massive earthquake and tsunami in the region around that date, consistent with sudden catastrophic flooding. In 2025, an archaeologist presented sonar scans of submerged concentric structures off Cadiz, Spain, matching Plato's description. Separate Spanish researchers found large circular structures stretching 450 meters in the same area. Neither discovery is confirmed. Both are being investigated. Story 18. Around 3000 BC, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia began writing things down, making them the authors of the oldest surviving literature on Earth. Among those texts are creation myths describing beings called the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, offspring of the sky god An. They appear in the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh. They are involved in the creation of humanity. They argue amongst themselves, flood the world, and interact with human kings. They are, by any measure, one of the most significant mythological traditions ever recorded, and for most of history, scholars treated them as exactly that mythology, complex and fascinating, reflecting how a sophisticated ancient civilization understood the cosmos and their place in it. Then, in 1976, a writer named Zecharia Sitchin published a book claiming the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru who came to Earth to genetically engineered Homo erectus into modern humans as a slave species and were the origin of every major world religion. His translations of the Sumerian texts were, according to every credentialed Sumerologist who examined them, either deeply flawed or entirely fabricated. The word Anunnaki translates to princely seed or royal blood not, as Sitchin claimed, those who came from heaven. The text nowhere described DNA manipulation, gold mining operations, or spacecraft. Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. Ancient Aliens ran for over 20 seasons. The mistranslations became more famous than the actual tablets. Here is what the tablets do say, and it is remarkable enough without embellishment. The Atrahasis describes the lesser gods rebelling and the senior gods creating humans specifically to relieve them of work. The Enuma Elish describes humanity formed from divine blood and clay. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis predates and parallels Noah's Ark with striking precision. These stories were written 5,000 years ago by people building the first cities, the first writing systems, the first legal codes, whatever they believed about their origins, whatever memory, real or mythological. These stories encode they are the foundation layer of all subsequent human narrative. The aliens are optional. The stories are not. Story 19. In 1587, 115 English colonists, men, women, children, including Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, landed on Roanoke Island off the North Carolina coast. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies almost immediately. He was delayed 3 years by the Spanish Armada. When he finally returned in 1590, the settlement was empty. No bodies, no signs of violence, just 2 carvings crow on a post, Croatoan on a palisade. That word has haunted American history ever since. The colonists told White before he left that if they had to move, they would carve their destination. Croatoan was not a mysterious final message. It was the name of a nearby island, now Hatteras Island, home to the Croatoan people, an Algonquian tribe with whom the colonists had friendly relations. White knew exactly what the carving meant. He intended to sail to Croatoan immediately. A storm forced him back to England. He never returned. And the answer the colonists left him was ignored for 400 years while everyone invented more dramatic explanations. Archaeology has now largely confirmed what the carving said. Excavations at Hatteras Island have uncovered 16th century English artifacts, a Tudor-era sword fragment, a slate writing tablet, copper wire, European ceramics mixed directly into Croatoan cultural layers. In April 2025, archaeologists found large quantities of hammer-scale iron forging byproduct at a Native American habitation site. Metalworking was not part of Croatoan technology. It came with at inland sites in Bertie County. 16th century English pottery has been found, suggesting a second group moved further inland. The colony split. Some went to Croatoan Island. Some went inland. Both groups assimilated. They weren't massacred. They did the most sensible thing available to 115 people stranded in an unfamiliar wilderness with dwindling supplies and no rescue coming. They joined the people who already knew how to survive there. The lost colony wasn't lost. It was absorbed. The mystery was never really a mystery. We just preferred the ghost story. Story 20. On December 4th, the Brigantine de Gratia spotted another vessel drifting erratically in the Atlantic between the Azores and Portugal. When the crew boarded, they found the Mary Celeste completely abandoned. No crew, no captain, no sign of struggle. The cargo, 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, was largely intact. The ship's provisions were untouched. Personal belongings were in place. The last entry in the ship's log was dated 10 days earlier. The lifeboat was gone. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew members had simply ceased to be on the ship. The Mary Celeste was in perfectly seaworthy condition. She had been sailing herself. The theories accumulated over 150 years. Pirates, but nothing. Mutiny, but no evidence of violence. And Briggs was considered a fair captain. Sea monster. Bermuda Triangle, despite the ship being nowhere near it. A giant waterspout. A seaquake. The crew getting into the alcohol and committing mayhem. None of them. The one that fits best emerged from a chemistry experiment conducted at University College London in 2006 and confirmed by Manchester researchers, the alcohol fumes theory. 9 barrels were found empty on arrival. Ethanol vapor had built up in the sealed hold. A spark 2 barrels rubbing together in rough seas. A crew member opening a hatch with a pipe triggered a pressure explosion. Loud, violent, completely invisible. Ethanol burns without leaving soot or char marks. The hold looked undamaged because it was undamaged. But the explosion was terrifying enough that an experienced captain ordered immediate abandonment into the lifeboat. The plan was almost certainly to stay close to the ship until the fumes cleared, then reboard. The lifeboat was attached by rope. In the North Atlantic swells, that rope snapped. 10 people drifted away from a perfectly intact ship that continued sailing without them. The ship eventually found new owners and sailed for another 12 years before being deliberately run aground in an insurance fraud. The people who abandoned her were never seen again. The most compelling explanation leaves no dramatic villain, no supernatural force. Just a rope, just the ocean, just bad luck at the worst possible moment. Story 21. In 668 C, a Greek engineer named Kallinikos fled Muslim-occupied Syria and arrived in Constantinople carrying something that would save the Byzantine Empire. Not an army, not a strategy, a chemical formula. The Byzantines called it sea fire or Roman fire. History calls it Greek fire. It burned on water. It couldn't be extinguished with water. It stuck to whatever it touched and continued burning. Arab survivors of the first siege of Constantinople described it as the lightning of heaven. When the Rus attacked in 941, their fleet was reduced to ash so completely that survivors said the Greeks had fire that fell from the sky and couldn't be put out. The Caliphate sued for peace after losing its navy to it. Greek fire didn't just win battles, it functionally saved Western civilization twice. The formula was classified at the highest level the Byzantine state possessed. Emperor Romanos II declared 3 things must never fall into enemy hands: the imperial regalia, a royal princess, and Greek fire. The first 2 were occasionally gifted to foreign powers. The third never was. The formula was known only to the Kallinikos family and passed verbally between generations, never committed to writing. Enemies captured the siphon devices that projected it and still couldn't reproduce the effect. The weapon was so well protected that its delivery system remained mysterious even to people who physically held it. Your instinct is right naphtha, and quicklime are the best guesses. Quicklime reacts violently with water, generating intense heat which would explain burning on contact with seawater. Naphtha as a petroleum base, pine resin as a thickener, sulfur to boost combustion temperature, possibly saltpeter as an early oxidizer. Modern researchers have produced incendiary compounds from these ingredients that burn fiercely and resist water. None perfectly matches every property the historical sources describe. The exact ratio, the exact refinement process. The precise combination died with the last person who knew it in 1453 when Constantinople fell. 800 years of military dominance, and the secret went out with the empire that created it. Story 22. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Complex animal life has existed for roughly 500 million years. Anatomically modern humans have been around for about 300,000 years. If you compress the entire history of the planet into a single 24-hour day, humanity appears in the last 2 seconds before midnight. The question you're asking, whether other species might have risen to intelligence and complexity before us, is not fringe. It is a legitimate scientific question. And the answer is one that should make everyone slightly uncomfortable. If it happened more than a few million years ago, we almost certainly wouldn't know. In 2018, NASA climatologist Gavin Schmidt and astrophysicist Adam Frank published a paper in the Journal of Astrobiology called the Silurian Hypothesis, named after fictional pre-human reptilian civilizations from Doctor Who, because scientists are exactly that kind of people. The paper doesn't claim pre-human civilizations existed. It asks something more precise. If they had, what evidence would survive? Their conclusion is sobering. Most physical structures, buildings, roads, metals, degrade completely within tens of thousands of years. The geological record, which we read in rock layers, compresses and transforms over millions of years through plate tectonics, erosion, and volcanic. A civilization that lasted even a few thousand years and then vanished 100 million years ago would leave almost nothing detectable today. What might survive are geochemical anomalies, unusual carbon isotope spikes, strange isotopic ratios, traces of industrial pollutants locked in ancient sediment layers. Fascinatingly, the Paleocene-Eocene a sudden warming event 56 million years ago, whose cause is still debated, produces exactly the kind of carbon signature that an industrial civilization burning fossil fuels might leave. Nobody is seriously claiming it was caused by a pre-human industry, but the paper makes a pointed observation. We would struggle to distinguish such a signature from the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it is the predictable result of 56 million years of geology doing what geology does. And our own civilization, if it ended tomorrow, would be archaeologically undetectable in most forms within 10 million years. We are the thing leaving marks. We have no guarantee we are the first thing that did. Story 23. The Maya had dogs. They had turkeys. That was essentially it for domesticated animals. No horses, no oxen, no llamas, those belonged to civilizations thousands of miles south in the Andes. Everything the Maya moved, they moved on human backs. Limestone blocks were carried from quarries to building sites using tump lines, leather straps attached to the forehead, distributing weight down the spine rather than through the arms, a technique that allowed individuals to carry extraordinary loads over jungle terrain. Larger stones were moved on wooden sledges and rollers. Earth ramps were built alongside rising walls so stones could be hauled to height. The tools were obsidian and chert volcanic glass and flint because the Maya had no iron or bronze. Every carved surface, every precise joint, every astronomical alignment was achieved with stone working stone. The construction method was additive rather than monolithic. Maya pyramids are not solid stone, they have rubble cores faced with precisely cut limestone. Each generation often built a new pyramid over an existing one, entombing the previous structure. Excavated temples at Karakol and Palenque contain 3 or 4 complete older buildings preserved inside them like nested dolls, each with original painted stucco still intact. The pyramid you see from outside is frequently the outermost layer of a structure that grew over centuries of successive construction. What makes it genuinely staggering is not just the physical labor, but the intellectual infrastructure behind it. The Maya independently invented the concept of zero. Their calendar system was more accurate than the Julian calendar Europe was using at the same time. El Castillo at Chichen Itza is aligned so precisely that on the spring and autumn shadow and light create the illusion of a serpent descending the staircase, a phenomenon that required both architectural precision and deep astronomical knowledge to engineer. They did this without contact with the old world, without sharing a single idea with Egypt or Greece or Rome. Everything they knew, they figured out themselves, in a jungle, with stone tools. That is the thing that should stop everyone cold. Story 24. During the siege of Syracuse in 212 BC, the Roman general Marcellus threw everything he had at the city walls and kept getting repelled by war machines designed by a single 75-year-old mathematician. Archimedes had built cranes that picked up Roman ships and dropped them. He'd built catapults calibrated to different ranges. And according to accounts written he'd built something stranger, an array of polished bronze mirrors or shields arranged to focus concentrated sunlight onto the Roman fleet, setting ships on fire from the walls of the city. The Romans finally took Syracuse, not by defeating the defenses, but by sneaking in through an unguarded gate while the city slept. A Roman soldier found Archimedes drawing geometry in the sand and killed him despite orders to take him alive. Marcellus reportedly wept. The death ray problem is this: no contemporary source mentions it. The first account appears roughly 350 years after the siege. Every historian who recorded the siege closer to the time describes the cranes and catapults in detail and says nothing about burning mirrors, which is odd, because burning an enemy fleet with concentrated sunlight is exactly the kind of thing you'd mention. The silence is the main argument against it. The physics, however, holds up. In 1973, Greek scientist Ioannis Sakis assembled 70 soldiers, each holding a large, polished bronze mirror, and aimed the combined beam at a rowboat 50 meters offshore. It caught fire. MIT students replicated the experiment in 2005 and set a wooden ship replica alight, though it required 10 minutes of stationary target and cloudless sky. Mythbusters tested it on a moving vessel in San Francisco Harbor and declared it busted. A Canadian teenager published a peer-reviewed paper in 2024 confirming the physics principle is sound. The honest verdict? Science is real. The weapon, the history, is thin. What almost certainly did happen is that Archimedes used every other weapon in his arsenal so effectively that by the time the story reached later writers, a man capable of building shiplifting cranes was plausibly capable of anything. The death ray may be what legend does to a genius when it runs out of adjectives. Story 25. The Great Pyramid of Giza has 3 known chambers: the subterranean chamber, the Queen's chamber, and the King's chamber. The King's chamber contains a sarcophagus. The sarcophagus is empty. Khufu's mummy has never been found. This fact alone has driven speculation for centuries that the known chambers are not the whole story, that somewhere inside 2.3 million stone blocks, the real burial lies untouched. The robots you remember from the 1990s explored narrow shafts leading from the Queen's chamber and found stone doors with copper handles and red ochre markings. Behind those doors, as far as the cameras could reach, lay more stone. What's beyond that is still unknown. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids mission Egyptian, French and Japanese scientists working in concert announced something that changed the conversation entirely. Using muon detectors, they found a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long, confirmed independently by 3 separate scientific teams using 3 different detector systems. Muons are subatomic particles produced when cosmic rays hit the atmosphere. They rain through everything constantly, but pass more easily through empty space than solid stone. The density map came back unmistakable. Something is up there. In 2023, the same mission confirmed a second space, the North Face Corridor, 9 meters long, wide enough to stand in, located just above the pyramid's main entrance behind the chevron stonework. The 2023 discovery was accessed through a crack in the masonry 6 millimeters wide, narrower than a pencil. A tiny endoscopic camera was threaded through and confirmed the corridor exists. What lies at the end of it, and whether it connects to the big void above, is not yet known. You cannot drill into the Great Pyramid to find out. Every investigation must be non-invasive, non-destructive, and approved by Egyptian authorities, who are understandably cautious about a 4,500-year-old structure that belongs to all of human history. The technology to see inside exists. The permission to look further is what's missing. Whatever is in those spaces has been sealed for longer than most civilizations have existed. It is tantalizing in the exact way you described. And it is getting closer. Story 26. On Boxing Day 1900, the lighthouse tender Hesperus arrived at Eilean, one of the remote Flannan Isles off the Scottish coast, for a routine supply visit. Nobody came to meet the ship. No flag on the flagstaff. No response to the horn or the flare. Relief keeper Joseph Moore went ashore and found the lighthouse door unlocked, the lamp untended, and no sign of the 3 men who had been stationed there since November. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, experienced keepers, not given to carelessness, had simply ceased to exist. The captain's telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board that day read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers have disappeared from the island." The details of the scene made it stranger. An overturned chair, a half-eaten meal suggesting a sudden departure mid-food. The clock stopped unwound for days. 1 set of oils still hung in the hallway, which meant 1 man had gone outside in severe weather without his waterproofs. The last recorded log entry was December 13th. The lighthouse had been dark since approximately December 15th. Whatever happened, it happened in those 2 days. The famous logbook entries describing an enormous storm, a weeping MacArthur, and a praying crew injected decades of Gothic mystery into the story, were later established to be fabrications added years after the fact. They never existed. The most credible explanation is unglamorous. The western landing showed clear signs of storm damage, ropes displaced, iron railings bent. A large stone weighing over a ton moved from its position. The investigation concluded that Marshall and Ducat had gone down to secure equipment stored in a crevice above the landing. A rogue wave, the North Atlantic, produces monstrous ones on that coastline, took them both. MacArthur, seeing they hadn't returned, went after them without his oilskins, perhaps in a panic. The sea took all three. No bodies ever surfaced. The lighthouse keeper, who was meant to be on duty that rotation, was on sick leave and survived by pure accident. 3 men died on a rock in the Atlantic in December 1900, and the ocean kept them. The mystery isn't what happened. The mystery is why it feels like it should be more than that. Story 27. The Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Legion, was one of Rome's most battle-hardened units. It had served in Spain, the Balkans, and Britain, survived Boudicca's rebellion in 60 AD, and was stationed at York Eboracum as the northernmost anchor of Roman Britain. The last confirmed inscription bearing its name was found at York and dates to approximately 108 AD. After that, in the entire surviving record of the Roman Empire inscriptions, dispatches, military rosters, administrative documents across 100 years of meticulous Roman record-keeping, the 9th Legion does not appear again. Not disbanded, not transferred on record, not mentioned in any account of any subsequent campaign. 5,500 men and their officers simply vanished from history. The Scotland theory that they marched north into Caledonia and were ambushed and annihilated by Pictish tribes is the most dramatic and has been popularized by novels and films. It is also the most contested. Archaeological finds at Nijmegen in the Netherlands show 9th Legion stamped tiles and brickwork from after 108 AD, suggesting the Legion or parts of it were stationed on the Rhine frontier. Some historians argue it was destroyed during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea in 132-135 AD. Others point to Hadrian's Wars. The problem with every alternative theory is that none of them have direct evidence either. They are all arguments from silence, pointing at a different silence. What is not contested: Hadrian built his wall across northern Britain in the 1920s, the most expensive military construction project in Roman history, almost immediately after the 9th disappeared from the record. The official explanation is that it marked a strategic withdrawal to a defensible line. The unofficial reading is that something catastrophic happened north of that line that required it. In late 2024, archaeologist Dr. Simon Elliott announced the discovery of Roman military artifacts near Cresswell in Derbyshire that may shed new light on the Legion's final movements. The investigation is ongoing. 2,000 years later, the 9th is still being searched for. Story 28. The oldest archaeological sites in Europe date to roughly 45,000 years ago. The oldest confirmed human sites in Oceania, in what was then Sahul, the ancient landmass joining Papua New Guinea and Australia, date to at least 50 to 65,000 years ago. Humans were living in the Pacific before they were living in Europe. And to get there, they had to cross open water. Even during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower and land bridges connected much of Southeast Asia, reaching Sahul required crossing open stretches of ocean with no visible landmass on the horizon. These were not accidental driftings. The distances involved minimum 90 kilometers of open sea, required intentional navigation, boats, planning, the ability to read currents, stars, and birds. 50,000 years before Columbus. The genetics of that journey is where it gets genuinely strange. Papua New Guineans carry the highest levels of Denisovan DNA of any population on Earth, remnants of interbreeding with a now extinct human relative whose fossils are known almost entirely from a single cave in Siberia. This means the ancestors of Papua New Guineans, somewhere along their coastal migration through Southeast Asia, encountered and interbred with Denisovans, a species whose range apparently extended from Siberia to the tropics. The Denisovan DNA, preserved in modern Papuan genomes, has been linked to adaptations including high-altitude oxygen metabolism genes that help Tibetans survive at extreme elevation, suggesting the Denisovans had spread across an extraordinary range of environments, and the interbreeding was more than incidental. A September 2025 study in Nature Communications confirmed using AI-powered genomic modeling that Papua New Guineans share their main ancestry with other Asian populations, not a separate out of Africa wave, as some earlier theories proposed, but that their extreme isolation, unique bottlenecks, and Denisovan inheritance make their genome one of the most distinctive on Earth. The visual resemblance to sub-Saharan African populations is convergent adaptation to tropical climate, not shared ancestry. They are among the oldest continuous populations outside Africa. Their ancestors were crossing oceans when the rest of the world was still learning to lead. Story 29. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appear in the fossil record at least 200,000 years ago, possibly 300,000. Their skulls and brains were the same size and shape as yours. By all neurological measures, they had the hardware. And for the vast majority of that time, they made the same stone tools their ancestors had made for hundreds of thousands of years before them. No art, no jewelry, no evidence of symbolic thought, no trade networks. The brain case that could theoretically compose symphonies or do calculus was being used to make slightly better hand axes, generation after generation, for 200 millennia. Then, roughly 50 to 70,000 years ago, something changed. Anthropologists call it the Great Leap Forward, or behavioral modernity, or the cognitive revolution. Whatever you call it, the archaeological record shifts abruptly. Cave paintings appear not crude scratchings, but sophisticated, representational art depicting animals in motion, filled with ochre, arranged with compositional intent. Jewelry, needles for sewing clothes, specialized hunting weapons, long-distance trade routes carrying specific materials hundreds of miles, ritualized burials with grave goods, music. The bone flute found at Holy Fells in Germany dates to 43,000 years ago and has 5 holes, a V-shaped mouthpiece, and demonstrates an understanding of scales. The same species that spent 200,000 years making hand axes suddenly started making art and music simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown. Nobody fully agrees on what a genetic mutation affecting language, the FOXP2 gene, linked to speech, appears in modern form in our lineage, but not in Neanderthals. A population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, possibly caused by the Toba supervolcano eruption, that reduced humanity to perhaps 10,000 individuals small enough for a new cognitive capacity to spread rapidly through the entire gene pool.